watching Mrs. America? This is the Hulu show that is about it's the story of Phyllis Schlafly. If you guys aren't familiar with her, she was like the kind of uber right wing. She was sort of the queen of the right wing. She was kind of the woman founder of the modern American right. And first of all, the show is really good. It basically portrays the fight around the Equal Rights Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment, which it never finally got ratified. We actually just saw a couple of states. I think Virginia just ratified it. Another state just ratified it. It got like this close to being ratified by all the states, so that we would have an Equal Rights Amendment to the United States Constitution. Women would have statutory equal rights to men, which we do not have in the Constitution right now. Kate Blanchett, who is brilliant. She plays Phyllis Schlafly in it. First of all, nobody in the show looks at all the actors like who they are. Tracy Ullman plays Betty Friedan. I didn't even know that was Tracy Ullman. She's really, really good. Bella Abzug is played by Margot Martindale, who's really great. Uzo Aduba from who you knew as Crazy Eyes, right? In Orange is the New Black. She plays Shirley Chisholm, and she's amazing in it. Sarah Paulson, you know from all the Ryan Murphy shows, and the American Horror Story. She plays Alice McRae. Rose Byrne plays Gloria Steinem. I did not know that was Rose Byrne. She is a great Gloria Steinem. You just go on and on and on. So it's real life characters. They're showing you the real stuff. Niecy Nash is in this. Niecy Nash plays a woman named Flo Kennedy, who was one of those sort of little known Black History Facts person. People don't know about her. And she was like this cowboy hat wearing, she was into, Black women's liberation. It's a great show because it tells you all about the kind of difficulties of both getting the Equal Rights Amendment, about women conservatives who, Phyllis Schlafly is this powerful woman. She's smarter than her husband. She's actually really good at foreign policy. She's an educated lawyer. She ends up going back to law school. She's this educated, independent, basically liberated woman, but who's telling other women they should not be liberated, that they should just be homemakers, and that their whole fulfillment in life should be to be a homemaker. But that's not what she was. She was like this powerful woman. It's a crazy show, but you should watch it. We're talking today with a good friend of mine, somebody that I definitely miss seeing, Jill Wine-Banks, who, interestingly enough, she has a book out called The Watergate Girl, which talks about her. She was one of the principal prosecutors of Richard Nixon. Her book takes place at around the same time as the Phyllis Schlafly story. These are two things that are happening at the same time. So you have this women's liberation movement that came not long after the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, where you have this fight over women's liberty and you have the Nixon fight all happening around the same era. So if you watch this show, Mrs. America, you're going to get a sense of the world that Jill Wine-Banks is living in and working in as this top prosecutor, who's also the only woman that is one of the prosecutors. So it is an interesting thing. It's just an interesting study. The 70s were very interesting. They weren't just disco. The 70s were not just disco. They were also about women's lib. And that's what we do here. We try to bring things together. We bring people together and people with books together. That's what we do on What to Read. All right, let's bring in our guest. And joining me now is somebody who you all know and love, Jill Wine-Banks, one of my favorite guests, who I miss very much, Jill and her pins. Jill Wine-Banks, how are you?
I'm excellent. All things are going well as far as staying indoors. I have a great partner to be locked up with. And so it's not the worst thing. It is. I miss amazing things, and I miss you and everyone else from MSNBC.
Yeah, no, we miss you too, Jill. It's been a surreal year in many ways, from impeachment on to the current pandemic crisis. It's been bizarre, right?
It is, and I would add to not just the pandemic crisis, but to the crisis in terms of democracy, because we're having Friday night massacres every week with the firing of another inspector general eliminating the possibility of having any kind of oversight, any meaningful investigation.
Yeah.
It's really been pretty terrible.
Well, and you know what we were lucky enough to have during the whole impeachment crisis, and as you said, this crisis in democracy that really we've been watching for 4 years running, was to have you, Jill, to talk to through impeachment, even before impeachment, because you actually were right in the middle of the impeachment of Richard Nixon, even though you were just a young girl. I'm looking at the pictures in your book, The Watergate Girl, and super cute, by the way. You will get a bonus if you read this book of so cute Jill Wine-Banks with her little outfits. And you actually, first of all, you're so small and cute. You could wear all these outfits now, I'm assuming. You are adorable in these pictures. But so you had a front row seat to the first one. Who do you think is worse in terms of flouting American democracy, Nixon or Trump?
I would say that Trump, because his goes beyond just trying to stop one investigation of himself and his closest aides. He has really started to dismantle all the institutions of government. And he has done things that include the emoluments clause that I think is a horrible thing, where he has not divested himself of his holdings, and he is profiting not just in general, but specifically, for example, from owning a hotel on a lease from the government. And that is something that should not be allowed. I think a lot of what we see is in public, and people have become inured to it. They're getting used to sort of thinking this is what he does and how it is. Whereas we were shocked when we heard the tapes, because Nixon did this all behind the scenes, whereas Trump is telling it to our face and has attracted a significant portion of Americans to believe that he's telling the truth when we know from real facts that he's lying. And I think that's really, in a way, more dangerous. They both have used the levers of government for their own benefit. Richard Nixon tried to use the CIA to stop the FBI from following the money trail, which would have led to proof that his campaign had paid for the burglary. And so he tried to get the CIA to falsely claim that it was a national security risk if they followed the money. And of course, Donald Trump does this every day, and now has a big helper with the Attorney General. The last Attorney General under Nixon, not the last, but the Attorney General under Nixon actually, of course, went to jail for his role. And it's possible that if William Barr keeps this up, he will follow suit with John Mitchell, because he is every day doing something that I consider to have no legal merit and to be only done to defend the president. His role is to defend us, the American people.
Yeah, absolutely. This book, The Watergate Girl, which the subhead of it is My Fight for Truth and Justice Against a Criminal President. Not subtle. The book opens up with like the main characters, like all of these characters with all these names we know. Rosemary Woods, obviously President Richard Nixon, Judge John Sirica, all the names that we know that have become legendary in this. But the Rosemary Woods story is interesting because she was kind of like the fall lady, right? Like she was the one who tried to allow herself to be the fall lady. You talk about these interviews with her and your participation in it. You're being intimidated by dealing with Judge Sirica, who's, all of these legends in front of you. Talk about that. Talk about Rosemary Woods. Why would she have been so willing to take the fall?
Well, I would say she was willing, look at what's happening now and all of the Trump aides who are doing what they're doing. Don McGahn's resistance to testifying now can only be explained by loyalty to the president. It's not in his best interest. I think that the relationship between Rosemary Woods and Richard Nixon was also an extraordinary one. Not only was it very long, she started working for him. She first met him when he was a representative in the U.S. Congress, before he was even elected a senator. They were together for many years. And as I learned in listening to tapes that weren't relevant to the criminal case, but that were just conversations between Rosemary Woods and Richard Nixon, she was an advisor to him. She was not just an assistant. She was his secretary. Today we would call it an executive assistant. And she had many people working for her because obviously her workload was enormous. One of the most interesting things is that I tried very hard to get people to talk to me who knew her well, people who were her relatives, her friends, her work colleagues, because I really wanted to portray her as they knew her, as opposed to as the caricature that she became, the cartoons of her doing the Rosemary stretch and twisted up, trying to do the erasure that she claimed. And no one would talk to me. They all felt I was the enemy and that they wouldn't give me information. I said this since the book came out on a radio show on NPR, on Morning Edition, and I got a phone call as a result of that from her grandnephew, who said he would be happy to talk to me. And we have had hours of conversation now, and I think that I could portray her more richly than I was able to do with his information. I learned a lot of interesting things, so that, for example, his mother was the daughter of Rosemary Woods' brother, and her brother was the sheriff of Cook County, which is, of course, where I am, is in Cook County. And so he was a well-known name to me, being from Cook County. His daughter, that was this man's mother, had a sister named Rosemary. So when he first met Rosemary Woods, he said, "You can't be my Aunt Rose. I already have an Aunt Rose. You're going to be my Uncle Rose." And for the rest of her life, the entire family called her Uncle Rose, and she loved it. She had apparently a great sense of humor and really warmly embraced being called Uncle Rose. And so those are the kind of insights that I think make her more of a human being.
Yeah.
He described her apartment in the Watergate office complex, which is quite interesting. And he described a lot about her character, her relationship with, she had one escort who was a very well-known PR person, Bob Gray, and who was also well-known to be gay. And of course, her family was appalled because they were strict Catholics. And she explained really who he was and what he was, and taught her family tolerance. And they came to accept him, and more generally became less homophobic. So I think that those kinds of things really portray her differently than she has been portrayed before. And if there's a second edition to the book, I would love to add some of that to it.
That is amazing. And well, before we get into a little bit more about the substance of the book, I want to. Well, I mean, this is what the book is about. How did you wind up as part of the Watergate investigation? Tell us that story.
I started out while I was in law school. In my senior year, I interviewed for jobs, as all law students do, and accepted a job on Wall Street. After graduation, I was studying for the bar exam, and my first husband came home and said, "I've decided I want to work in Washington. We're moving to Washington." So I had to call the firm, quit my job, move to Washington, and start looking for a job after everybody else was already hired and when the next class was interviewing. And in a city where I had no contacts and knew no one. And in the days of typewriters, where every letter was individually typed and directed at the person you were trying to get a job with. And I just randomly wrote letters. And then I luckily met someone who worked in the organized crime section of the Department of Justice, who took my resume and gave it to the boss. And that's how I got hired, was really through networking. And it was a dream job because I had excelled in law school in advocacy and trial practice and really wanted to do trial work, although I was much more defense-oriented than prosecution-oriented. And I loved my job, but realized after a year of being there that I hadn't tried a case yet. I was still arguing appeals, which is where everybody starts in the department. And I went to the boss. I had no other colleagues, no female colleagues. I was the only woman in the section and one of the only women in the whole department at the time. And certainly on the criminal side, there was a very senior woman who was head of the appellate division. And so I said to him, how come I'm not trying cases? And he said, well, because you're a girl and you'd be much more vulnerable in a courtroom. And I simply said, well, what did you fail to notice about me when you hired me as a trial attorney? Obviously, I was a woman then, I still am. And so speaking up for myself is what led to my finally getting my first trial. And that's where I started. My direct supervisor was the smartest lawyer I've ever known. His name is Chuck Ruff. He was absolutely brilliant and wonderful. And he got hired almost immediately by the Watergate office. And this is all before they actually were appointed and started. Gave them my name. And I got a call from the person who was doing the interviewing, who was another Harvard law professor who worked with Archibald Cox, James Warrenberg. And I set up an interview, went in, and he said, when can you start? And I was puzzled because it sounded like, when could I start the interview? Right now. And he said, no, I mean, when can you start work? I said, well, don't you have questions for me? Is there something you want to know? He said, no, we've checked out your background. You have a great record at the Department of Justice, and we want you. And I ended up basically doing two jobs almost immediately because I had to finish up turning over my cases at Justice to other people. And so that's how I got the job. I'm sure, it was partly through the connection to Chuck Ruff. Mm-hmm. And it was just a great break. Now, when I was interviewing, it wasn't clear which team I would be on. And I was very lucky because I was put on, the main cover-up case, which ended up being the case that was really significant in this. Although all of the cases, our office had a lot of campaign contribution cases, dirty tricks investigations, and they were all important as part of the pattern and practice of a corrupt White House.
Yeah.
And so I was very lucky to be one of the three trial lawyers on the case. We had a bigger team who helped us prepare for trial, but in terms of handling witnesses and arguing in court, it was Jim Neal, who was the senior person from Nashville, and Richard, as he is now known, but then was Richard Benveniste, who came from the Southern District of New York, who was also a Columbia graduate, as was Chuck Ruff.
Wow.
So
you were on the A team, basically. You were on the A team.
I mean, they were all A teams. They were all really, really good teams.
Yeah.
I have no, definitely, but this is the one that was the case against the president that
Absolutely.
Ended up with him as an unindicted co-conspirator.
Indeed. And you even write about finding out your apartment was bugged. Like, what is that like to find out, oh, okay, so you thought that there was a break-in, but it turned out, I guess they were just bugging your apartment, but they had already bugged it before? I mean, was it bugged
Right.
twice?
Yeah, it turns out that there were probably two break-ins. I never was aware of the first one, but when I came home and found my door ajar, and again, in the days before cell phones, obviously, if I came home now and found my door ajar, I would step out, call the police. I would not enter without police. But I had no way of calling except to enter my house and call. So I went in, looked around, called the police. And when they came, excuse me for a minute, something caught in my throat. It's not anything worse than that. When they came in, they asked if they could use my phone to call a mobile crime lab to get fingerprints. And I said, sure. And when the policeman hung up, he said, there's something strange on your line. There's some resistance here. And now he did not know who I was or that I was involved in the Watergate case. As soon as he left, I called the FBI, the agent who was working with us, Angie Lano, and he sent a team over to check, because resistance on the line obviously could mean a wiretap. And what they found was that there were deviations in the screws. You could see scratches in it, that they believed that it had been tapped, but someone had come back and removed it. And so it was no longer there. In those days, they had to physically attach a tap to the phone. And I have to say, although I had been involved in wiretapping defendants under search warrants, under Title III, which had just become law, so we were involved in one of the earliest uses of wiretap laws, legal wiretapping, and had never really thought about the privacy aspects, because I knew we were looking for criminal activities,
right,
and we had to prove it to a court that there was criminal activity. The thought that someone was listening to my conversations was really disturbing, and not because I thought I had leaked anything about Watergate. I was hardly ever home.
Yeah.
So the chances of my having said anything would have been very limited. And I was careful about that anyway. But I did have some private secrets that would have been revealed or could have been revealed if someone had wanted to.
Yeah.
And there was a humorous episode the day after when the burglary was announced. One of the reporters from the New York Times asked the deputy press secretary, Warren, whether he could say for sure that the White House burglars hadn't, the team that was known as the plumbers, that had broken into the Watergate for the case that became the Watergate burglary and break-in, whether he could say for sure that they hadn't broken into my house. And he was irate and screamed back, "No, can you say for sure it wasn't the New York Times?" So it was quite amusing. And then another network wanted to film how they had broken in. And I was adamant that they could not, that was like an open sesame to any future burglar saying, "Oh, here's a person who's gone all day. Let's just break into her house. And this is how they did it."
Yeah.
So, but it took Leon Jaworski calling the head of ABC to get them to not do it. It might have been CBS. It was Connie Chung. I think that was CBS. Anyway, he called the head of the network and got her not to film at my house.
But, I have to ask you this question because, you write, there's so much of the book you write about even, the sort of trying to have a personal life. You write about your parents and their reticence to talk about the family's history and the Holocaust, and just sort of your own life and who you are. One of the great things that people will get out of this book is they'll find out more about you. But I do have to ask one more Nixon question, because it is something that I think a lot of people, that has confounded people. Why did he why keep those tapes around? I've never understood why. I mean, it was the incriminating thing. It was the thing that did him in. Have you ever been able to understand why it is that he would want to have those tapes? Did he somehow think, oh no, they're going to go in his library at some point? Like, why have them?
That is exactly why. He felt that he could use them for one of two things. One is to help him write his memoirs, and the other is for possible financial gain in selling them. And remember, there was a tax case against him about his papers and taking a deduction for his papers, which actually are clearly owned by the government. So yes, he was foolish. He also, like Donald Trump, and by the way, in my book, I do not mention Donald Trump until the epilogue. And yet I think you will see clear comparisons.
Yeah.
But like Donald Trump, he felt he was above the law. He would never have to give them up. It was foolish and dangerous, and it made a huge difference, because had he burned them in the few days between their becoming public and our subpoena, which is, he had less than a week to do this, but if he had analyzed and thought about it and destroyed them, he wouldn't have been in violation of a subpoena. Once the subpoena was issued, if he destroyed them, that would have been obstruction of justice and would have been a crime. But before that, he could have almost gotten away with it. And the thing is, although we believed our witnesses, and our true crime witnesses were, of course, John Dean and Jeb Magruder, and they were very compelling in what they said, particularly John Dean against the president. But in terms of a jury giving the benefit of the doubt to the president versus John Dean, we felt in a he said, benefit of doubt would go to the president, and it would be very hard to prove the case. Once we got the tapes and heard the president in his own voice, in his own words, confirming everything that John Dean had told us, but more importantly, just having a jury be able to hear him saying, let's use the CIA. Yes, I know where I can get $1 million. I can get it. When he was being asked about how much he would have to raise for hush money to keep the burglars from saying that they were working for the committee to reelect the president, known as CREEP, or for the White House. So he would have probably gotten away with this crime if he had destroyed those tapes. Maybe not, because the evidence was still pretty compelling just from John Dean's memory, but it would have been a tough case to make.
Yeah. And I cannot, I would be remiss if I did not ask this. I think that everybody who is listening to and checking out this What to Read episode would be upset if I didn't ask you this question. How did the pins thing start, Jill Wine-Banks? Where did the pins thing come from? We need to know about the pins.
And by the way, I hope you got the pin of your book, similar to the pin I'm wearing today, which is a replica of the cover of my book. Good.
Yes.
So the pin thing, if you look at the pictures in the book, you will notice that in almost every picture from my high school photograph, my high school, graduation picture on, I am wearing a pin. I just have always liked pins as a fashion accessory. And now they used to just be because I picked them because they were pretty. Now I pick them because they have a message. And it started when I was first on MSNBC. I observed that all the men wore flag pins. And I thought, oh, that's so trite. There has to be a better way to comment on patriotism. And I happen to have in my collection, I've collected these pins for years. And I had one that was a very old celluloid pin, almost invisible because it was a clearish, grayish color, but it was an eagle holding a shield that said, "Defend America." And while I thought, well, no one will notice it, it's not as shiny as the flag pins, it's better than a flag pin. But sure enough, someone on Twitter noticed it and said, "Oh, I love your pin, tell me more about it." And so then I thought, well, if I'm able to send a message through my pins, I'll start looking for other pins that have messages. And I just started doing it, and it caught on to the point where my pins have their own hashtag, and they have their own website, they have their own Twitter handle, Twitter page, and it became a thing. And people started sending me pins, and I've gotten the most wonderful pins are from my fans. They are fantastic. Each and every one of them is very special. And I was planning to do a Jill's pin book, and a fan had sent me the best title, which I'm hoping to use, called Broaching the Truth.
Yes. The
Trump administration through Jill's pins. And
absolutely.
I think it would be wonderful. So that's something I'm, once I finish with the book tour, or restart the book tour for the Watergate Girl, I will start looking at working on that.
I love it. Well, I have to show before I let you go, Jill Wine-Banks. So this is my favorite page of the pictures. There are a lot of great pictures in this book. First of all, I love the fact that Marvel Comics makes it into the Watergate Girl, because of course you are the prototype for a heroic Marvel character. But I love this picture, which is the bossest picture It's like Nancy Pelosi level boss. It's Jill Wine-Banks sitting at a table with all these men, and she's the most commanding and cutest figure in this photo.
Oh.
This is an awesome photo, and this is because you also served as general counsel to the U.S. Army, the first woman to hold that position, the only woman in the room in the photo. And so my exit question to you, other than we described your pin, right? We described the pin you have on now. I'll let you end with that. But
right, I did.
You did. And so what was it? I mean, what did it mean to you to be in this era of American politics, to be a woman in command, a woman who was pretty much usually the only woman around, who was dealing with all of this stuff?
Yeah, the only woman in the room was an early possible title for the book, because that is what I was most often.
Yeah.
And by the way, that Pentagon job was one of the best I've ever had. I really, really loved the people I worked with, and the issues that I had to deal with, and the opportunities to advance women in the military, which obviously is not part of the general counsel's role, but
Yeah.
I added to what I was working on. And it was a time when harassment and discrimination were rampant. Not so much sexual assault, but just real out-and-out discrimination. Discrimination was not illegal.
Mm-hmm.
There were still help wanted ads that listed help wanted male, help wanted female. And you would interview for a job and people would say, well, we can't possibly hire you because everyone else is a man and there's travel involved and we can't let you travel with a man. And it was legal to say those things. In job interviews, I was asked, how many children are you going to have? What kind of birth control do you use? If you were having a dinner party, what would you do if a client had an emergency and you had to interrupt your dinner party? I mean, questions that no man would ever be asked. And even the fact that the press covered the trial with identifying me as the mini-skirted lawyer, or using my name, today wearing a pink miniskirt. No man was subject to being identified by what he wore. So it was tough, and it was tough because there was no one for me to consult, anyone to go to say, no, I noticed that it's a year and I'm not getting trials and my male colleagues are.
Yeah.
Who could I ask about that? And it was tough, but it was a challenge to my creativity. And so I would sit down and say, well, okay, this seems to be a problem. How do I solve it?
Yeah.
And my hope is, obviously we've made huge progress. I do not believe that we're as far as we should be. I think that all the things that were coming out in the Me Too movement and in general life, I think we'll be better off when we get out of this pandemic. But I think we aren't as far as we could and should be. And I just hope that in reading this, people, men and women, will see solutions to discriminatory behavior and will treat each other more equally.
Yeah.
When I first started at Justice, I was the only woman, and so at coffee break time, the discussion was always about sports, something that I have never read the sports pages, I admit. And I don't follow sports, except for maybe the Cubs. I am a loyal Cubs fan. And I was a Bulls fan during the Michael Jordan era.
Sure, of course.
Of course, who wouldn't be?
Right.
But my first husband, who, as you know, doesn't fare so well in the book, he did have one good thing about him. He would give me a sports line every morning, so that I would have something to say as part of the coffee break time. And so that was wonderful. And as the years progressed, of course, and as more and more of the men had working wives, they started talking about recipes and shopping and childcare, things that had never been discussed in the first 10 years of my career, started to be subjects that were of concern to them. So things have definitely improved, but let's keep that going. And my proudest things are when a woman is my successor. So my successor as general counsel was a woman. And that means I didn't mess up too badly so that they didn't say, hey, we can never hire another woman. Women just can't do this job. So that's one of the good things. And Watergate opened a lot of doors for me, including that job,
Yep.
but many others. So, and included reintroducing me to my high school boyfriend,
Yes.
who is now my husband of 40 years.
I love it. The Watergate Girl, My Fight for Truth and Justice Against a Criminal President. Jill Wine-Banks, congratulations on the book. Congratulations on the book tour, the virtual book tour. Hopefully be able to see each other in person sometime soon. Yes, and thank you for the pin. You're the greatest. Jill Wine-Banks, love you. Thank you.
Love you. Look forward to a hug.
Yes, absolutely. Virtual hugs. Thank you so much to my friend, Jill Wine-Banks, the Watergate Girl. Please support this author and all of the other great authors. Please buy some books from your local bookshops. Don't just support the big bookshops. Get things online. Make sure that you get some books to your homes so you guys can feed your brain. Please give us a like. Please give us some comments below. Please share the What to Read podcast, REID, spell it right. Support us on all of our social media. And of course, subscribe to the One Mic Network, because that's where you're going to get all this great content that feeds your brain. Listen, what else you got to do? You guys are home anyway. You might as well share it, love it. See you guys on the next edition of What to Read, and spell it right, REID. See you guys. Bye.